The stench reached the outer chambers first. Not the pleasant rot of aged meat or the sharp tang of human waste, but something far more specific, the sweet, cloying reek of flesh dying while the heart still pumped. By the third day, courtiers held pomanders to their faces as they bowed. By the fifth, even the king could not mask his revulsion. The woman lying in the royal apartments was not merely dying. She was decomposing, piece by piece, while fully conscious. This was no medieval peasant succumbing to plague in a ditch. This was a queen, a woman who had shaped the politics of 3 nations, a consort whose intellect had guided the most powerful throne in Europe, and yet her body betrayed her with a completeness that erased every distinction of rank. The gangrene spread beneath her skin like a dark tide, turning living tissue into black, liquefying matter. The physicians could do nothing but watch, and she knew it. Her name was Caroline of Ansbach, Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland. She died in 1737, but the manner of her death, meticulously documented by court physicians, courtiers, and her own anguished attendants, remains one of the most clinically detailed accounts of bodily decay in royal history. Chapter 1. The Philosopher Queen. Caroline Wilhelmina of Brandenburg-Ansbach was born in 1683 in the small German principality of Ansbach, daughter of the Margrave. She was not destined for greatness by birth, but by intellect and calculation. Orphaned by the age of 13, she became ward to the Electress Sophia Charlotte of Prussia, a woman of formidable learning who maintained a court that valued philosophy as much as protocol. Here, Caroline studied under some of the finest minds in Europe. She corresponded with the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. She debated theology, read Locke, and mastered the delicate machinery of Enlightenment thought that was reshaping European power. She was beautiful. Yes, this mattered at court, but more dangerous than beauty was her clarity of purpose. When suitors came, she assessed them as one might assess a treaty. The Archduke Charles of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor, proposed marriage. She refused. He was Catholic. She was Protestant. The match would require her conversion, and Caroline understood that religious identity in the complex lattice of European power was not negotiable. Instead, in 1705, she married George Augustus, Electoral Prince of Hanover. He was not handsome, he was not particularly intelligent, but he was Protestant, and he stood in direct line to the British throne under the Act of Settlement. Caroline knew what she was purchasing: future power. The marriage was political, but it functioned. She bore him 8 children. She managed his temper. She cultivated the alliances that would matter when the crown finally came. In 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain died without surviving issue. The throne passed to George I, Elector of Hanover, Caroline's father-in-law. George Augustus became Prince of Wales. Caroline became Princess of Wales. And though she did not yet wear a crown, she began to wield influence. George I spoke limited English and preferred Hanover to London. His son, her husband, was volatile and easily manipulated, but Caroline was neither. She became the silent hand behind policy, the voice that whispered in her husband's ear before he spoke in council. Ministers knew, to influence the prince, one had to win the princess. In 1727, George I died. George Augustus became King George II. Caroline became Queen Consort. She was 44 years old, and the power she had cultivated for decades was now formalized. She worked closely with Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, effectively co-governing while her husband indulged his mistresses and his military fantasies. For 10 years, this arrangement held. Caroline was the true architect of British stability during a period of delicate European balance. But beneath the robes and the jewels and the political mastery, her body was failing in a way that no one, perhaps not even she, fully understood. Chapter 2. The concealed weakness. The exact origin of Caroline's hernia is not recorded. It may have begun after one of her many pregnancies. It may have developed gradually, the muscular wall of her abdomen weakening over years. Hernias were common, especially among women who had borne multiple children. The abdominal wall, strained and torn by repeated stretching, could rupture, allowing internal organs or tissue to protrude through the opening. In most cases, hernias were manageable. Trusses, supportive belts designed to hold the protruding tissue in place, were widely used. Surgical repair was possible, though risky in an age before anesthesia or antiseptics. But most importantly, hernias were visible. They were known. They could be treated. Caroline chose concealment. Why she made this decision is a matter of historical speculation, though the reasoning is not difficult to reconstruct. A queen's body was not private. It was a political instrument, a symbol of continuity and strength. Any visible weakness could be exploited by rivals, used as evidence of divine disfavor, or leveraged in the ruthless calculus of court intrigue. More personally, Caroline had spent her entire life constructing an image of control and intellect. To admit physical vulnerability would crack that facade, and so she hid it. For years, perhaps as many as 10, she wore specially designed undergarments that held the hernia in place. She allowed no one to see her undress except her most trusted ladies, and even they were sworn to silence. The secret was kept. The hernia, for a time, remained stable. She governed, she managed her husband, she shaped policy, but the human body does not negotiate. And hernias, when left untreated, do not simply persist unchanged, they worsen. Chapter 3. The crisis begins. In early November 1737, Caroline felt the change. The hernia, which had a dull, manageable ache, became sharp. The pain radiated through her abdomen and down into her groin. She ignored it. She had meetings with Walpole. There were diplomatic dispatches from the continent. Her husband was in one of his moods. She could not afford distraction. By November 9th, the pain had intensified to the point where she could not stand upright for more than a few minutes. She retired to her chambers earlier than usual, claiming fatigue. The ladies in waiting noticed her pallor, but said nothing. That night, alone in her private apartments, Caroline felt the hernia bulge further. The tissue that had been held in place for so long had finally broken through its restraints. She pressed her hands against her abdomen and felt the unnatural protrusion beneath her skin. She still told no one. On November 10th, she forced herself to attend court functions. She smiled. She spoke. She stood beside the king during an audience with foreign dignitaries. The pain was now constant, a grinding, twisting pressure that made her vision blur. She excused herself early, retreating once again to her chambers. By the evening of November 11th, she could no longer hide the distress. Her ladies found her doubled over, gasping. The hernia had become strangulated. The tissue that had pushed through the abdominal wall was now trapped, pinched by the very opening through which it had protruded. Blood flow to the area was cut off. Without blood, tissue begins to die. This is when decomposition begins. Not after death, during life. Chapter 4. The physicians discover the truth. The king was summoned. George II, whatever his personal failings, was genuinely attached to his wife. He arrived in her chambers and found her writhing in pain, her face slick with sweat. He demanded physicians. The court doctors were called: Dr. John Ramby, the king's sergeant surgeon, and Dr. Hans Sloane, the president of the Royal College of Physicians, among others. Caroline, even in agony, resisted examination. She understood what it would mean to reveal the hernia. But the pain had become unbearable, and the physicians insisted. Finally, In the presence of her most trusted attendants, she allowed them to examine her. What they found horrified them. The hernia was massive, larger than a man's fist. It had been concealed for so long that the tissue had become thickened and scarred. But worse, far worse, was the strangulation. The tissue was dark, mottled, no longer pink and healthy. The physicians recognized the signs immediately. Gangrene, the tissue was dying. And if it was not removed, the necrosis would spread, releasing toxins into the bloodstream. The condition was called mortification in the medical language of the time. The patient, in essence, would be poisoned by their own rotting flesh. The physicians conferred in hushed tones. Surgery was the only option, but it was desperate. There was no anesthesia. The patient would have to endure conscious agony as the surgeons cut into living tissue. There was no concept of sterile technique. Infection was almost inevitable. And Caroline was 54 years old, weakened by days of pain and the toxic burden of dying tissue. She agreed to the surgery. Chapter 5. The surgery. On November 13th, the surgery was performed in Caroline's chambers. The room was cleared of all but the essential physicians and attendants. The king was present, though he stood at a distance, unable to watch fully. Caroline was laid on a table. Her legs were held down by attendants. There was no opium strong enough to dull what was to come. Dr. Ramby made the first incision. Caroline screamed. The sound echoed through the apartments, through the corridors, reaching courtiers who stood pale and silent in distant rooms. The surgeon cut deeper, exposing the strangulated tissue. It was black and necrotic, weeping fluid that smelled of rot. He removed what he could, cutting away the dead flesh, trying to reach healthy tissue that might heal. The hernia itself could not be fully repaired. There was no technique for that, but the dead tissue could be excised, and the hope was that the remaining tissue might survive. The surgery lasted over an hour. Caroline endured it conscious, biting down on a leather strap, her hands clenched into fists. When it was finished, she was pale as parchment, soaked in sweat and blood. The physicians bandaged the wound and administered what palliatives they had: wine, weak opiates, reassurances. For a brief moment, there was hope. The surgery had been survived. Perhaps the worst was over. It was not. Chapter 6. The decomposition. By November 15th, the smell had begun. The wound, despite the physician's best efforts, was infected. In an age before germ theory, before antiseptics, infection was nearly inevitable in any surgery. Bacteria entered through the incision, through the unwashed hands of the surgeons, through the very air of the sick room. The infection took hold in the damaged tissue, and the gangrene that had begun in the strangulated hernia now spread through the surgical site. The smell was unmistakable. Those who have smelled gangrenous tissue report it as uniquely foul, sweet and rotten simultaneously, with an underlying sharpness that clings to the nostrils and throat. It is the smell of putrefaction, of proteins breaking down, of flesh liquefying. The courtiers who entered the Queen's chambers could not hide their reactions. Pomanders filled with cloves and lavender were distributed. Incense was burned. It did not help. Caroline was aware. She was conscious, lucid, fully aware that her own body was rotting beneath the bandages. The physicians changed the dressings daily, and each time they revealed more necrosis. The tissue around the wound was blackening, weeping pus and bloody fluid. The infection was spreading into the deeper layers of the abdominal wall, reaching toward the peritoneum, the membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. If it breached that barrier, sepsis would follow. Death would be certain. She began to fever, not the mild warmth of a common illness, but the spiking, violent fever of systemic infection. Her temperature soared. She shivered uncontrollably, then burned. The sheets had to be changed constantly, soaked through with sweat. Her pulse became rapid and thready, her breathing shallow. The physicians applied poultices, changed dressings, bled her in the mistaken belief that it would balance her humours. Nothing worked. The gangrene continued its advance. The smell intensified. By November 18th, visitors to the outer chambers could detect it. By November 19th, it permeated the entire suite of apartments. Imagine the psychological torment. Caroline had spent her life in control of her image, her intellect, her political influence. Now she lay helpless, her body betraying her in the most visceral and humiliating way possible. She could smell her own decay. She could see the revulsion in the eyes of those who attended her, no matter how well they tried to hide it. She knew she was dying, and she knew it would be neither quick nor dignified. Chapter 7. The Final Days. By November 19th, Caroline knew the end was near. She asked to see her children. They came, one by one, and she spoke to each with the clarity that had defined her life. She gave instructions, offered blessings, and said her farewells. To her husband, the king, she spoke with surprising tenderness. Despite his infidelities, despite his temper, there had been something real between them. She urged him to remarry after her death. He wept and said he would never take another wife, only mistresses. It was, perhaps, the most honest moment of their marriage. She asked for Archbishop of Canterbury and took communion. She prayed, though what solace faith offered in the face of such physical agony is unrecorded. The fever spiked higher. The infection had reached the peritoneum. Sepsis set in. Her body, already weakened by days of suffering, began to shut down. Her kidneys failed, reducing her urine to a dark trickle. Her skin took on a greyish pallor. Her extremities grew cold as her circulation collapsed, the body prioritizing the core organs in a futile attempt to preserve life. On the evening of November 20th, 1737, Caroline of Ansbach died. She was 54 years old. She had been Queen Consort of Great Britain for 10 years, and she had spent the final 10 days of her life decomposing from the inside out. Chapter 8. Aftermath AND Autopsy. The death of a queen requires procedure. Within hours of Caroline's death, the physicians performed an autopsy. It was both a medical obligation and a political necessity. The cause of death had to be officially determined, recorded for history and for the succession. The autopsy confirmed what the physicians already knew. The gangrene had spread extensively through the abdominal wall and into the peritoneal cavity. The intestines showed signs of infection. The hernia had been present for years, possibly more than a decade, based on the scarring and thickening of the tissue. The strangulation had been the final crisis, but the underlying condition had been developing in secret for much of Caroline's adult life. The report was clinical, detailed, and unflinching. It was also damning in its implications. Had Caroline sought treatment earlier, the outcome might have been different. A hernia, managed with a truss or repaired surgically before strangulation, was survivable. But concealment had turned a manageable condition into a death sentence. The autopsy findings were shared among the medical community, discussed in the Royal Society, and debated among physicians across Europe. Caroline's death became a case study in the dangers of untreated hernias, in the risks of surgical intervention, and in the limits of medical knowledge in the early 18th century. But for the public, the details were suppressed. The official announcement spoke of a mortification of the bowels, which was true but vague. The smell, the gangrene, the decomposition, these were not fit for public consumption. A queen's death had to be dignified, even if the death itself had been anything but. Chapter 9. George's Grief. King George II, who had spent much of his marriage indulging mistresses, and raging at political opponents, was shattered. The courtiers, who had expected a swift return to routine, were stunned by the depth of his grief. He had lost not just a wife, but the intelligence that had guided his reign. Caroline had been his counsel, his check, his political mind. Without her, he was diminished. He kept his promise after a fashion. He never remarried, but he took mistresses, as he had said he would, and he ruled for another 23 years. Yet those who knew him reported that he was never the same. He kept Caroline's rooms exactly as she had left them. He spoke of her often, and when he died in 1760, he requested that his coffin be placed beside hers, with the adjoining sides removed so that their remains could mingle in death. Chapter 10. Political consequences. Caroline's death had immediate political ramifications. Sir Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, had relied on Caroline's influence over the king to maintain his position. Without her mediation, Walpole's power began to erode. Within 5 years, he would fall from office, ending the longest tenure of any British Prime Minister to that point. The court itself shifted. The intellectual salons that Caroline had patronised lost their royal sponsor. The philosophers and writers who had enjoyed her support found themselves without access to power. The Hanoverian court, never particularly cultured, became even more focused on military and diplomatic matters, less on Enlightenment ideals. In a broader sense, Caroline's death illustrated a truth that the 18th century was only beginning to confront, that power, wealth, and status offered no protection against the failures of the human body. The same gangrene that killed a pauper in a charity hospital killed a queen in a palace. The same stench filled both rooms. The medical knowledge that might have saved her did not yet exist, and the medical knowledge that did exist could do little more than document her suffering. Chapter 11. How History Remembered. In the decades immediately following her death, Caroline was remembered primarily as the consort who had influenced George II, as the patron of Walpole, as the mother of Frederick, Prince of Wales, with whom she had feuded bitterly. The gruesome details of her death faded from public memory, preserved only in medical texts and the private letters of courtiers. Later historians, particularly those writing in the Victorian era, sanitized her death further. It became a tragic illness, a regrettable medical failure, stripped of its sensory horror. The decomposition, the smell, the conscious suffering, these were considered too indelicate for polite history. It was only in the 20th century, as medical history became more rigorous and less prudish, that the full details of Caroline's final days were re-examined. Historians returned to the original sources, the letters of Lord Hervey, who had been close to Caroline and who recorded details of her illness with clinical precision, the autopsy reports preserved in royal archives, the medical journals that had discussed her case. What emerged was a portrait not just of a political figure, but of a human being whose body failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Caroline of Ansbach, the philosopher queen, the political strategist, the woman who had shaped British policy for a decade, died as everyone dies, reduced to flesh and pain and the indifferent mechanisms of biology. Chapter 12. The lesson of the body. There is no uplifting moral to extract from Caroline's death. She did not die for a cause. She did not sacrifice herself. She simply concealed a medical condition out of pride or fear or political calculation, and that concealment killed her. But her death does illuminate something essential about the nature of power in the pre-modern world. Power was embodied. It resided in the physical presence of the monarch, in the health and vitality that demonstrated divine favour or natural right. A weak body suggested a weak reign, and so The powerful concealed their weaknesses, sometimes until concealment became fatal. Caroline was not the first ruler to die from a treatable condition made lethal by delay. She would not be the last. But the documentation of her death, the unflinching detail of the autopsy, the letters describing the smell, the medical analysis of the gangrene, makes her case particularly vivid. We can reconstruct, almost day by day, the process by which a living body became a decomposing one while the heart still beat. The 18th century physicians who attended her did their best within the constraints of their knowledge. They could identify gangrene, they could attempt surgical removal, but they could not prevent infection. They could not administer antibiotics that would not be discovered for another 2 centuries. They could not offer anesthesia that would spare her the agony of conscious surgery. They could only watch and document and try to offer comfort where cure was impossible. Caroline endured it all with a stoicism that impressed even those who recorded her suffering. She did not rage. She did not curse. She made her arrangements, said her farewells, and died with the same composed dignity she had maintained in life, even as her body decomposed beneath her skin. Epilogue: the persistence of flesh. Caroline of Ansbach was buried in Westminster Abbey on December 17th, 1737. The funeral was conducted with full royal honours. The coffin was lead-lined, sealed, designed to contain the remains for eternity. But of course, it did not. Nothing is eternal. The body within continued its decomposition, slower now in the absence of life, but no less complete. Today, visitors to Westminster Abbey walk past her tomb without a second glance. The marble is cold and clean. The inscription is dignified. There is no mention of gangrene, no acknowledgement of the smell that once filled the royal apartments, no record of the screams during surgery. History has sanitized her death, as history so often does. But the contemporary records remain, preserved in archives, available to those willing to confront the reality of pre-modern death. And that reality is this: Caroline of Ansbach, one of the most intelligent and politically astute women of her age, died slowly and in agony, her body decomposing while she was still alive, unable to escape the consequences of her own concealment. Power could not save her. Wealth could not save her. Intelligence could not save her. The human body, in the end, answers to no crown. It follows only the implacable logic of biology. When tissue is starved of blood, it dies. When it dies, it rots. And when it rots inside a living body, it kills. This is not a story with a lesson. It is simply a story of what happened, of how a queen died, of how power and flesh collided, and flesh won. The smell, they say, lingered in the apartments for weeks after her death, even after the body was removed, even after the rooms were scrubbed and aired. Some stains cannot be removed. Some truths cannot be concealed. And some deaths, no matter how royal, are simply and irreducibly human.